So instead of having somebody like an engineer in the driver's seat figuring out their prompt, it's more about how do I set the system up to be able to iterate on a task or goal and improve itself and just keep kind of rolling and set.
Welcome back, everyone, to our next episode of First Pass, where we aim to break down the latest trending topics in AI in short, quick, digestible videos. Today, we've got Dan Farrelly with us, the CTO and co-founder of Inngest, to talk about loops, which is the thing everyone's talking about who's building agents. Dan, thanks for being with us today.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.
Awesome. Well, look, no one's talking about prompting anymore. Everyone's talking about writing loops, setting goal functions, letting agents iterate across themselves. Break this down for us. Like, what is prompting dead? What is a loop?
Yeah. So, it's a buzzy thing right now. And I think it's useful to look at like just what you talked about, right? In the early days of LLMs, people just talked about prompting and getting a response, right? These one shots. And then we started moving towards agents, right? Prompting the agent's doing some things in a loop, not to be too confusing, but you're thinking about still prompting. What am I giving to the agent to get my outcome, right? And I think what this recent shift towards loops is actually talking about things at a higher level. So how am I setting a higher level goal that a system, and that could be agents or different tasks, to complete that? So it is like a loop supervising loops in that sense. So instead of having somebody like an engineer in the driver's seat figuring out their prompt, it's more about how do I set the system up to be able to iterate on a task or goal and improve itself and just keep kind of rolling and set.
Well, you break down the loop into 3 layers: the loop, the skill, and the orchestration. What could you walk us through each one?
Yeah. So I think what's interesting about it is that, when you take this concept of loops outside of coding agents, locally, and you put it into production systems, it kind of means that it has to, the system has to run in a loop. It has to take the state of the system of whatever the goal of the loop is, and it needs to act upon that, right? So I think it's useful to think about these like kind of 3 components in the system. And one is the loop, right? That's like the decision maker, right? There's a trigger, could be a schedule, could be an event, and it needs to do like I said, it takes the inventory of what's going on, it passes into an LM, and it decides, what do I do right now, right? And it continuously runs. And then when you can think about the skills, and the skills are what can it do, right? And I think this is where like in the thinking about it like a system, these skills, and not to be confused with agent skills, that's a whole other thing. It's a little confusing. I don't think we've settled upon these terms yet, but the skill itself is a workflow or a task or something higher level or a sub agent or something that it can invoke to perform these to like, work in the system. And then the orchestrator itself is basically like the brain of the system. Is how does the loop actually invoke things, right? How does it call upon a skill? How does it check, did this skill complete? How did it make sure that something's running? How did it run it on time? And I think what's interesting about that is like the orchestrator is the kind of the foundational layer that you just kind of expect to be invisible. You expect it to just work, but there's a lot that's going on there when it comes to a loop in a system. It's heavily based on this loop needs to run consistently, it needs to run durably, and it needs to be able to call upon these skills or do different tasks all the time, 24 hours a day. Because it's basically like at that point, you're building an autonomous system.
It's clear that loops are becoming a more and more important part of agentic architectures. But what you argue is it's not just the loop, it's what runs the loop. What do you mean by that?
Yeah. So I think that there's been a lot of folks recently, as they've been talking about this topic, that have talked about what is the loop, right? What is the pattern? What are the components? But I don't think that enough people are talking about how that actually runs the loop effectively, right? It's about the system itself. And I think it shifts because teams need to stop necessarily focusing so much on like the model itself and start thinking about the system that runs the model, right? The whole system that is encapsulating this. What triggers the loop? When does it run? What state is it evaluating? What skills or other functions or agents is it invoking? How does it recover from failure? So I think in those situations, in my opinion, there's not enough people talking about that. What are the requirements of what it needs to be capable of, right? The orchestration layer, and how does it, say, deploy code? How does it execute something that runs something? How does it self-improve? How does it go write and iterate on these skills and improve its own system? How does it look back at history and understand, what did I do in the last 7 days? Did I complete this task? Did I perform it well? And I think that is a more, when you shift the whole thing a layer deeper, which is like that whole system thinking side of things. And I think that's where there's a lot more interesting problems to solve. And there's, I think, a lot of, there's not as many people, I think, digging into that right now.
Yeah, I mean, in many ways, like hearing you talk about this, when I think of loops, I almost think of workflow on steroids, or just autonomous workflows where, hey, in the past, when you had a workflow, you needed to manage state, you needed to manage retries and failovers. And there's kind of like a universe of things that you needed to manage. With a loop that's running autonomously with kind of some end goal, the challenges become a lot harder than just, hey, how do I handle retries? How do I handle failovers? How long should I let a task run before I put it into a failure state? And this might be in the middle of the night at 4 a.m. when you're sleeping, so you really want to have these things defined. How do you think about a new problem space or a new set of challenges that emerge in these loop architectures? And you've kind of hinted at it on like, hey, we need new things, it needs to be different, but you maybe make it a little concrete. Like what challenges do developers run into when building loops, and how should we think about solving those challenges?
It becomes, because there's a lot more, like the loop has to execute a lot of different tasks and is doing a lot more on a meta level, on a higher level. I think you have to think a little bit more about how it is executing all these different tasks, how it is managing all these different tasks, how it is improving these different tasks. Can the loop itself edit these things and redeploy it itself, right? Or re-register these tasks within a system? How does it identify these things? And when this kind of comes down to this layer, it ends up being a little bit more of thinking about, how are you creating the system of which it can be successful and it can improve itself, right? It kind of shifts more closer to like this idea of, instead of you delegating something to a junior engineer, when you can think of a coding agent today, you're trying to create something that can replace a human in that loop, right? So it is, you're triaging, the infrastructure. So how do you go check all the different, what needs to be checked, all the different metrics, the logs, et cetera, and then decide, all right, given the state of the system, what do I do right now? How do I improve this? How do I do this faster? So I think there's this whole idea of, how do you learn from itself? How does it, find out, did this task, or this skill that I wrote, was it effective, right? Did I have the observability? Was I able to check on, did this fail? So when you're running in the system, it needs to be able to understand the system of which it's running in itself, right? So it needs to be able to look at history. It needs to be able to invoke something. It needs to be able to kind of be orchestration aware, is what I think. And I think that understanding that problem is what will unlock the biggest capabilities for a lot of these teams designing these systems.
Loops, it's all about how can we recursively make them better?
Exactly.
Well, on that topic, Satya says that the moat is no longer the model, it's the loop. What's your take on that? And how should developers think about building agents with that in mind?
It was an interesting post, and it kind of really took off. And I think, he looked at it as like two kind of buckets of like, there's human capital, right? That's judgment and whatnot. And then there's token capital. What are they building? And like, what do you learn over the span of time? Right. And I think that, when you think about these kind of systems, it's like, how you're generating the feedback loop, right? And this is how like product teams exist today. When you think about it, it's like you ship something, there's product, there's feedback, it comes back into the system, and you iterate, you make it better, and you ship the next thing, right? And I think what happens is like, to truly leverage the power of LLMs, I think it's about getting them into a way into this loop that can improve based on all of these a system that you set up. So what's the signal that this workflow generated, right? It's kind of more of a higher level. Let me set the goals of the system and how it can evolve and grow itself. And I think that is, it's feeding that capital back into the system and improving and building upon that capital over time. It's a compounding engine. And I think that's what is really interesting about it. And I do agree. There's some really, really good valid points of what he wrote about.
Awesome. Well, Dan, thanks for joining us and talking about loops. I think we're going to hear a lot more about loops over the next few months.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate it.